The Pacific Northwest, revered for its beauty, cascading mountains, rolling waves, and gorgeous sunsets attract many tourists from all over the world. And many of them line this very shore, unaware that beneath the beauty lies a brewing disaster. Beyond these rolling waves lies the Cascadia subduction zone. And for over 320 years, pressure has been building between two tectonic plates. And when that pressure is released, experts warn that we could experience one of the worst natural disasters in our modern day history. An earthquake with the power to be so destructive, Pacific Northwest locals often refer to its impending doom as the big one.
The big one.
Big one.
Big one.
The big one?
What most people think of as the big one is a magnitude 9 subduction earthquake that would occur just west of Vancouver Island.
We are so overdue for an earthquake here in the Lower Mainland.
And it would create some pretty violent shaking across the region.
Which is a concern, but again, challenging to predict the unpredictable.
Across this two-part special investigation, our team will travel by land, air, and sea to provide you with a full-scale picture of what the big one could look like.
Let's go.
Let's go. And how it may impact Vancouver and surrounding areas. We'll bring you interviews with industry-leading experts in the fields of science, engineering, policy making, and natural disaster preparedness, providing you with the most up-to-date information so you can prepare for what may be the biggest disaster to impact the Pacific Northwest in modern history. Earthquake seismologist Professor John Cassidy has been studying the Cascadia subduction zone for over 30 years. An industry leader in his field, Cassidy outlines how and when a megathrust earthquake could hit our region.
The North American plate, of course, is all of North America. It's a huge tectonic plate, one of the biggest in the world. The Juan de Fuca plate that is created just offshore, just west of Vancouver Island, a few hundred kilometers, is moving towards us at between 4 and 6 centimeters each year. So that ocean plate is being pushed towards North America. When it reaches North America just offshore, it's actually stuck. So it causes the western edge of North America to be squeezed and to buckle while it's in that lock state. Typically that lock state continues for hundreds of years, somewhere between 250 and 850 years. But eventually, just like you can bend a stick for so long, but eventually it breaks, the rocks along that fault zone will break, and the Juan de Fuca plate, that oceanic plate, will slip 10 or 20 or 30 meters in a matter of a minute or two. So that would be the big one. That would be the magnitude 9 earthquake. And the reason it's considered the big one is that it's an 1,100 kilometer long fault. It extends from Vancouver Island all the way down to Northern California. So it's what we call a subduction fault, where an ocean plate is being pushed beneath North America. Those are the largest earthquakes in the world, and they're rare events, but they've happened off of our coast before, just as they've happened in Japan.
In 2011, Japan was hit with a magnitude 9 earthquake. It triggered a devastating tsunami. The natural disaster killed a near 20,000 people. It was the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in Japan's history. Experts warn that a megathrust earthquake even more powerful could hit our region. And new research states that we may be underestimating its potential scale, and that the big one, well, may be even bigger than first predicted.
There is the suggestion that the segment off of southern Vancouver Island, off of Washington State, is a very smooth part of the fault. It's that type of fault that produces more slip, which in turn produces stronger shaking. And the other item they found was that it's shallower, which means potentially a larger tsunami in this region.
Cassidy warns there is a 1 in 10 chance that the big one will strike in the next 50 years, and that our best indicator of future events comes from studying the past.
So based on both work on land and beneath the ocean, we see evidence for 19 of these earthquakes in 10,000 years. Roughly every 400 to 500 years, one of these magnitude 9, the full rupture, takes place. The most recent magnitude 9 was in the year 1700, It was January the 26th at 9 p.m. We know the exact date, we know the exact time. So Japanese tsunami modelers were able to take the records, the heights and arrival times, and work backwards and determine that it was a magnitude 8.7 to 9.2 earthquake just off of our coast, off of Vancouver Island. Very precise time and day from the Japanese data, but it also fits perfectly with indigenous oral traditions all along the west coast from Vancouver Island to Northern California that describe strong shaking, describe a tsunami that came ashore and destroyed winter villages, caused landslides, and shaking that continued for days, which would have been the very strong aftershocks.
Vancouver is a city of over 2.6 million people. Cascading Mountains, the backdrop to a city rich in culture and natural beauty. It is the third most populated city in Canada, but it's also situated on the west coast, approximately 150 kilometers away from North America's most dangerous fault line. So tell me, John, what would happen in the first 4 to 5 minutes of initial impact right here in Vancouver?
Here in Vancouver, for this type of an earthquake, a magnitude 9 offshore, the shaking would be strong shaking for 4 or 5 minutes. Following that, there may be power outages, broken glass, chimneys that have come down, damaged buildings, infrastructure across the region.
Daniel Stevens, director of Vancouver Emergency Management, advises individuals to seek cover as soon as the shaking begins.
Cascadia subduction zone earthquake is going to last a long time, and it's going to feel even longer when you're in the middle of it. So that's why we suggest people getting under a table and counting to 60 once the shaking has stopped. We would have a number of buildings that facades would come off, so especially the unreinforced masonry buildings. So we'd have parts of buildings that would be falling off. There would likely be a number of buildings that collapse. Some of our bridges may be impacted so that they're not usable to cross. There could be fires that start. One of the big risks in following an earthquake is the fires that come afterwards. So those can come from people's cooking appliances that are on at the time, candles that get knocked over. Could be damage to gas infrastructure. We'll be looking at tens of thousands of buildings that are damaged, thousands of people who are displaced from their homes, significant damage to infrastructure of all kinds in the city, water systems, sewer systems, electrical systems, communication.
Professor Carlos Molina Hutt, a structural and earthquake engineer, says building collapses are likely to occur and the damage could be deadly.
It's only fair to expect that we are going to experience widespread damage. There are going to be different types of buildings that are going to experience different types of damage, and it is possible that associated with that damage there could be some injuries and fatalities.
Carlos, we're walking in Gastown right now, the oldest commercial district in Vancouver, and you can really see that in the infrastructure. We've got cobblestone-lined streets, historic buildings, but if we take into consideration all that history, Carlos, how would an area such as this fare in a magnitude 9 earthquake?
This region could experience considerable damage because it has a large concentration of older buildings, unreinforced masonry buildings. These are the typical brick buildings that you can see around us. These were constructed anywhere from 1880 to 1990, and generally they're very vulnerable to earthquakes, as we've seen in large events in other parts of the world. Some of the challenges are that the brick doesn't have any reinforcing, and therefore it's not well connected together, and this is what could lead to potentially partial or total collapse of some of these structures, simply because these buildings are very vulnerable, and even though some may have been retrofitted, the large majority have not. This is something that we need to think about in order to increase the resilience of this particular neighborhood.
Professor Perry Adamar is renowned in the field of seismic engineering, specializing in high-rise structures. He met us downtown to discuss how building codes are working to strengthen the integrity of buildings around the city. Shaking is expected to last 4 to 5 minutes. What is the risk here when it comes to maybe falling debris, glass, etc.?
Yeah, there is the possibility that glass could fall off some buildings. Most of the modern buildings are designed so that the curtain wall can tolerate the movements. But yeah, you'll see some debris come off buildings, but hopefully not too much in and around the modern buildings.
And when we talk about the West End in particular, what do we know so far about the safety in that area?
Well, that's where we have a lot of older, quite tall buildings that were built before we designed the buildings the way we do today. Okay, so if you go prior to the mid-'80s, we built buildings very differently than we have done sort of after 1990. So there is a concern that many of them may be damaged, and then there'll be large areas of the West End which will have to be cordoned off. But again, these buildings need to be looked at carefully by knowledgeable engineers and assessed to see whether there are serious concerns.
All right, John, to get a better idea of what would occur during the big one, let's explore Vancouver's waterways.
Let's go. North Vancouver is
It's over there.
pretty much due north, so this is all Point Grey and Kitsilano.
Oh, wow. Closer to the beautiful mountainscapes that we're seeing right now. How do you see them being impacted?
Right, so mountains that are susceptible to landslides, you add in the earthquake shaking and you have a much better chance of seeing landslides. And that's what we've seen in the past on Vancouver Island, shaking from earthquakes triggering hundreds of landslides. Landslides into inlets or into lakes or even rivers can then trigger localized waves that can be very substantial.
So sort of localized tsunamis.
Exactly.
Tofino is a small and quaint surfing town located on the west coast of Vancouver Island. Surfers and tourists alike travel to this very location to experience its beauty and serenity. But beyond these rolling waves, as close as 20 kilometers from where I stand right now is the Cascadia subduction zone. Now, this is the meeting point of two tectonic plates, the Juan de Fuca plate and the North American plate. And for over 320 years, these two plates have been building up pressure. And once that pressure is released, experts warn that this very shoreline could be the front line for the big one. A megathrust earthquake could create a tsunami as tall as 10 stories high.
The best models at this time for West Coast communities, Vancouver Island, 5 or 6 meters of the wave height. But what that translates to is it's like an incoming tide. It just keeps coming in. So if it's 5 or 6 meters high, it runs inland to heights of 10 or 12 meters.
I'm Hillary O'Reilly. I'm the Emergency Program Coordinator with the District of Tofino. It's challenging to predict the unpredictable. There's many complexities to the big one that are unknown. We know little bits and pieces from historical data as well as Indigenous local knowledge.
Taloquiet man Joseph Bob grew up hearing tales of a tsunami sweeping through his hometown and wiping out villages.
I come from the Taloquiet First Nation. We've been here for centuries, I guess you could say. Mears Island, the village of Opitsa, is where we originally resided, and that is one of Canada's oldest reservations. And my family just told me that centuries ago that there was a big earthquake. Following that, a tsunami did come in, took out some of our village.
We're walking along the shores of Chesterman's Beach, one of the most popular tourist destinations of the region. Let's say a tsunami were to hit. What are the safety considerations around that?
There's two key warning signs that we encourage folks to pay attention to. The first is ground shaking from an earthquake. If there's intense ground shaking, immediately evacuate to high ground. You don't necessarily need to wait for instructions, those are coming. The next thing that will happen will be our tsunami siren will go off. It is a loud, wailing tune. You can't mistake it. It will also come with pre-recorded instructions explaining to move to high ground safely and calmly.
And what about tourists and visitors that frequent this area? What is the protocol for them to ensure that they're informed and they need to get to higher ground?
Ideally, visitors and tourists are picking up information along their travels, whether that's their hotel concierge or even the evacuation pamphlet in their hotel room. The sirens are designed to be as clear and concise as possible. We also know residents are welcoming and supportive. If they were to see someone on the beach, I'm very confident that they would indeed guide them and say, hey, it's time to go.
Vincent Hollingsworth has been in Tofino for 2 years and now calls this town home and is aware of the dangers that come with living on this coastline.
I'm a lead instructor here at Pacific Surf Co. Ever since moving to Tofino, earthquakes and tsunamis were something I was very aware of and very sort of worried about as well. Thing is, especially when I'm in the water and being an instructor, is we do a lot of kind of safety related to tsunamis. So we kind of have two defense systems, which is obviously there's the towers. If we hear those go off, we're told it's around about 20 minutes or so for us to get to high ground. If we see the tide kind of receding at a quick rate, we've only got around 5 minutes or so. which is definitely a little bit spicy, a little bit scary. So depending on where I surf, I've kind of got a different plan. Like at Cox Bay, you can go to the top of the lookout there, which you could get easily 20 meters in sort of 5 minutes or so. If I was surfing at North Chesterman, because I live there, I would be walking down to the beach as well. So depending on the day, could take you a couple minutes to even get to the beach, and then up to our house is probably another sort of 3-4 minutes if I was running full speed. So yeah, there's honestly not the most amount of places to go. But yeah, especially if it's that sort of, it's a very localized earthquake tsunami. Yeah, it's gonna be pretty close.
And what's your biggest worry when it comes to this?
My biggest worry is not being able to make it to safety with there only being one road in and out of Tofino. Say the beach is packed and the parking lot is packed and everybody is rushing out all to get into safety. I feel like that might be a little bit of a holdup. That would definitely be my biggest worry, is not being able to make it to safety.
Coming up on the big one, could you make it to high ground in time to flee a tsunami? We're already 4 minutes down from the shoreline. Find out next. Tofino local and seaplane pilot Sean Porter has conducted scenic flights in the area for decades. So to get a better idea of the geography of Tofino, we're taking to the skies.
Tofino is buffered by the ocean and Pacific Rim National Park. On the left here, these are our local beaches. We've got our 2 resort beaches, Middle Beach and Mackenzie Beach, followed by our surfing beaches, Chesterman's Beach and Cox Bay.
So Sean, everything we see here would be inundated with water in the event of a tsunami.
Yeah, looking to my left here, you can see how wide and exposed the coastline is. There's nothing between Vancouver Island and Japan, just thousands of miles of water.
The geography of Tofino is what makes it both beautiful and hazardous. The wide open beaches are lay-lowing, and the district of Tofino advises that to ensure safety from a tsunami, people must evacuate to an area that stands at least 20 meters above sea level. These safe zones are marked here in green on this map. But for those south of town, your options to get to higher ground are limited. So how long is it going to take you to get to safety? Well, CityNews is going to put this to the test. I'm standing here at North Chesterman's Beach, one of the most popular tourist destinations of the region. Now imagine a tsunami hits. The sirens blare, starting off a 20-minute countdown for you to get to higher elevation. Let's start the timer. Looking at the Tofino district evacuation map, the closest safe point to North Chesterman's Beach is above Parley Place. From shoreline to safety, I need to cover a near 2.3 kilometers of distance and 50 meters of elevation gain. All right, so we now reach the car park. We're already 4 minutes down from the shoreline. Now, this route isn't clearly marked, although there are evacuation signs like this one. It's unclear which direction I need to head in. It's a race against the clock. I'm at Parley Place, about 300 meters from the safety point. All right, so I just made it to higher ground, the closest elevation point from Chesterman's Beach. But did we make it on time? Unfortunately not. This recorded time is based on me power walking this route. Our producer ran the same distance and made it to safety in approximately 13 minutes. Our team also timed driving a component of this journey. Their time, without traffic, 7 minutes. And this road is already gridlocked just in the summertime. Imagine what it'll look like in the event of an emergency when thousands of people are trying to evacuate. But these timings are based on our team knowing directions, not hesitating or getting lost, and are all completed without the stress of having to navigate this while fleeing an impending tsunami. The good news is the district of Tofino is aware of the lack of high ground near some of its most popular beaches and are developing new projects to better manage and limit the risk found in low-lying areas.
So one of our key projects right now, and we're in the middle of assessments and designs, is to develop a vertical evacuation structure that will be built in some of these low-lying areas closer to our beaches. We are looking at other coastal communities around the world that do have successful vertical evacuation structures in place and learning as many lessons from them as we can.
And we know the Pacific Rim Highway just down there is the only road in and out of town, and that's likely to be backlogged in the event of an emergency. So what's the protocol around that?
We're consistently assessing that and building in different aspects to our emergency response and recovery plans to address those funneling concerns that will likely happen. And so whether that's signage infrastructure, which is currently in the works, or emergency response vehicles with loudspeakers and guidance to help folks evacuate along the way. The most important thing to remember is indeed to get to high ground quickly, calmly, and as safely as possible, whether you're driving motorcycle, bicycle, or indeed even walking.
Next week on The Big One, Part 2, the aftermath. Experts share what happens in the weeks, months, and years following a megathrust earthquake.
We're talking about aftershocks that will actually continue for months and likely for years.
Surviving the big one, we tell you what you need to do to prepare for the unpredictable.
Practicing the drop, cover, and hold on, getting underneath the table, that is going to save lives.
All this and more next week on The Big One, Part 2. Vancouver is a city of over 2.6 million people. Cascading mountains, the backdrop to a city rich in culture and natural beauty. It is the third most populated city in Canada, but it's also situated on the west coast, approximately 150 kilometers away from North America's most dangerous fault line, the Cascadia subduction zone. And for over 320 years, pressure has been building between two tectonic plates. And when that pressure is released, experts warn that we could experience one of the worst natural disasters in our modern day history. An earthquake with the power to be so destructive, Pacific Northwest locals often refer to its impending doom as the big one. Now, the fallout from North America's largest earthquake is expected to have long-lasting economic effects. Tell me a little bit more about the damage here. How many lives lost? What is the aftermath of an earthquake of this magnitude?
Yeah, it's a tough question. There have been a few studies that have shown estimated damage in the $40 to $60 billion range. So older buildings and, an earthquake of this magnitude covering such a huge area, certainly fatalities, hundreds if not thousands, and injuries. So this is one of the world's largest earthquakes. They're very rare events, but this is one of the world's largest types of earthquakes.
Our team took a helijet to explore Vancouver's skyline to get a better idea of what the city could look like in the aftermath of a megaquake. We're about to take off. From the sky, you can see how densely populated the city of Vancouver is. Visually, you can imagine the devastation that multiple high-rise buildings could cause should they collapse. You can also see how heavily dependent our city is on bridges. There are just two main roads connecting Metro Vancouver to the north and west: Lionsgate Bridge and Iron Workers Memorial Bridge. Navigating the city will be hard. Building and structural collapses will likely limit access in and around Vancouver, and damage to roadways and bridges may leave people isolated.
And especially initially, where bridges are closed, even if they're structurally sound, but closed to the public while they're being assessed. So we've done a lot of work regionally in seismically upgrading bridges, but they will need to be assessed following an earthquake if it's of significant magnitude.
Engineer Perry Adebar says entire neighborhoods could be deemed uninhabitable for years following a megathrust earthquake.
If a tall building is damaged and there's a possibility the building could collapse, you need to evacuate a zone around the building, which is 1.5 times the height of the building. And that can be a very large zone. And when you have a place like Vancouver West End with lots of older buildings, it would take just a few tall buildings in Vancouver's West End to essentially close the West End. All the streets, all the adjacent buildings, they would all have to be closed. As long as it takes to demolish the building, to take the buildings down. It's quite difficult if the building is badly damaged. It's quite difficult to repair. It is possible sometimes, but that's the rare occasion. Most often when a building is badly damaged, it has to be demolished, and that takes a long time, maybe years, depending on how many buildings and how tall.
Many prepare for the moment of impact, but what happens in the days and weeks that follow? So John, talk to me a little bit more about the aftershocks. How long are we in a so-called danger zone?
Yeah, so the larger an earthquake is, the larger the aftershocks will be, the longer they continue for, and the larger an area that they cover. So for a magnitude 9, which is one of the world's largest earthquakes, we're talking about aftershocks that will actually continue for months and likely for years. They'll drop off, they'll become less frequent. So in the first minutes, and the first hours, and the first few days, that's when most aftershocks will take place, but they'll continue for a long time. And they can be very large earthquakes in their own right in this case. And if an aftershock is closer to you, the shaking can be stronger than the larger main shock.
In a natural disaster, seconds and quick decision-making make the difference between life and death. At the moment an earthquake strikes, Daniel Stevens, director of Vancouver Emergency Management, advises individuals to consider your surroundings and plan accordingly.
Seconds count in an earthquake, definitely. Natural Resources Canada is working on a public early warning system for earthquakes, and that will alert people with maybe 10 to 15 seconds, maybe a little bit longer, depending where the epicenter of the earthquake is. And those seconds are crucial. They allow people to take protective measures, get down off ladders. They allow sky trains to automatically slow down and come to a stop. They allow surgeons in an operating room to take actions that can be taken to protect the patient a few seconds before an earthquake starts. So at the time of an earthquake, you might be taking a stroll outside, and you want to make sure that when you feel that shaking, that you drop cover and hold on, get away from overhead power lines or anything away from buildings, anything that might fall on you. If you're at home, you'll want to, again, drop cover and hold on, protect your head. If you're able to get under a table and hold on, you should take that action.
Stevens says the city's first responders will be prioritizing rescue efforts in critical zones and warns that support services will be limited.
Our fire department will be heading out of their fire halls very, very quickly after the earthquake starts. But their initial focus is to do a damage assessment of the city to understand where the most critical response needs to take place. So they're not going to stop at the first sign of damage. They're going to keep going to assess the critical places like our schools, like our hospitals. So it could take hours or longer to support. And many people will be on their own afterwards. If people are in a single family home that's slightly damaged, it's going to take a long time for restoration companies and homes to be rebuilt. So people are going to have to take care of themselves.
Natural disaster preparedness expert Jackie Kloosterboer advises individuals to have critical supplies that last for at least 1 week following an earthquake.
It could be quite some time. If roads and bridges are damaged, our supplies are not going to be coming in. So to be prepared for at least a week to 2 weeks is going to work better for you and your family. It's not difficult to do. It's a matter of going out, collecting the basic items, and just making sure you've got enough water, you've got enough food. So you need to think everything through and have a plan, have those supplies ready to go. The big one, I think, for us here is definitely the earthquake, and we are so overdue for an earthquake here in the Lower Mainland, and it's only a matter of time. We've had a number of little earthquakes over the last little while, and that is an excellent wake-up call to the fact that we need to be prepared. Okay, there's different types of disaster kits that you need to look at, and a go bag is a kit that you're going to take if you have to evacuate in a hurry. Your grab and go bag will have basic items in it you need, but having those basic items, copies of your insurance papers, copies of important documents, your cell phone charger. In my grab and go kit, one of the key items is an AM/FM radio. This is how you're going to get updates on what is happening. All of the radio stations will be broadcasting where reception centers are, the extent of the emergency and disaster. You also want to have a first aid kit. Having some basic medical supplies is going to make a big difference. Having a headlamp, a flashlight, by wearing the headlamp, it frees up your arms if you have to help somebody. Having a whistle, and this is essential for the earthquake. If you can blow on a whistle, it's much easier to get people's attention rather than having to yell and yell.
Now here's a quick checklist of the items you'll need in your grab and go bag. First, the essential items. These are the survival necessities. And then the more sentimental items. These are the nice-to-haves, items that hold sentimental value. Following the moment of impact, it's expected that communication lines will be down. So no internet, no phone lines, no way for you to contact your loved ones.
And what people need to remember with earthquakes is you're not going to be able to pick up your cell phone and connect with your family. So how will you connect if your phones aren't working? You need to have plans for it.
Kloosterboer advises individuals to include an emergency meeting point in their disaster plan.
This is Vanier Park, right in the middle of Vancouver, and this would make an excellent meeting location for you and your family if you live in this area. It's an open field and it will be busy. There'll be a lot of people here, but if this is the location you're choosing, bring your family down here. Identify the location where you're going to meet. Record that in your emergency plan. A disaster plan is really about sitting down with your family and what if. What if we have an earthquake and we're together? What would we do? What if we're not together? What would we do? And, just thinking up all of the different scenarios that can happen, just start taking the steps. Start writing your family plans and making sure you are prepared. Once you've got these plans in place, when something happens, you're going to be much better able to survive it.
When it comes to response efforts and emergency preparedness, the City of Vancouver says it's ready.
We can't predict the time of day that an earthquake can happen, so we have plans in place so that we can respond during daytime or nighttime. But the reality is an earthquake happening at night is going to take longer to mobilize some of our supporting resources. But we do have our critical resources, our fire department, our rescue teams, Vancouver Police. They are working 24/7.
Stephen says at the moment an earthquake strikes, no time will be wasted as first responders are prepared to react quickly and efficiently.
So in terms of the actions that staff in the City of Vancouver would take, we have a number of protocols, some of which would rely on communication systems being in place. So we'd have some very rapid coordination calls with our emergency management team, with leadership, and with some key departments across the city. Communications are down. We have automatic procedures to activate staff to our emergency operations center to begin the coordinating, and for first responders to start doing rapid damage assessments throughout the community. So you see things like the fire trucks doing assessments throughout the community, and other staff, our building officials, etc., would be moving to initiate more building-specific damage assessments so we could understand how bad the earthquake was, where response resources need to be.
Structural engineer Perry Adabar says the city has made advances in building safety standards, but warns they still have a long way to go.
The city has done a lot in recent decades to improve the preparedness, so I would say it's much better now than it was a short time ago. Certainly much more needs to be done. If you ask me what's the biggest thing in my opinion, we have older high-rise buildings that could be very unsafe in an earthquake. And a little intervention at this time, a little repair, could do a lot to prevent that building from being badly damaged or even prevent it from collapsing. So for me, one of the most urgent items is for the city to mandate an assessment of all their older buildings.
So Perry, when we talk about some of these older buildings that may be more prone to structural collapse or damage in the event of an earthquake, what about the people who live within these buildings?
Yeah, that's a good point. No one has informed people that live in buildings that could potentially collapse. No one has told them that they're in such a building. Buildings get built, decades ago, and there's nobody that goes and looks to see whether these buildings meet today's standard. So one of the things that needs to be done is for the city to mandate an assessment of all older buildings. And the city is working towards doing that.
Associate Professor of Engineering Carlos Molina-Hutt advises government agencies on how to better equip infrastructure to survive a megaquake. However, Molina-Hutt warns that current modeling and forecasts are dated, leading to a gap between policy and science.
So one of the key challenges that we face in the Metro Vancouver region, not just the city of Vancouver, is that this whole area is effectively sitting above glacial and river sediments that are underlain by sedimentary rock. This sedimentary rock is effectively a lot softer, it's less stiff than some of the surrounding bedrock in the mountains that surround our cities. And as a result of that, what could happen is that the ground motion shaking could be amplified. The best way to think about this sedimentary basin is almost like a lens-like basin, and what you could try to visualize is as the wave propagates through the basin, they're going to get amplified, and then as a result of that, the shaking is going to be more severe than what we currently anticipated. I say that because our current national seismic hazard model, that's the hazard model that estimates the shaking that we could experience in different parts of Canada, that's used to inform the building code, doesn't explicitly account for this basin. So some of our research has shown that the amplification can be considerable, and what we're trying to do is leverage those research findings to ensure that in future editions of the National Seismic Hazard Model, those amplification effects are considered explicitly. There are other basins in this region, in the Pacific Northwest. We can just look at our neighbors to the south in Seattle, and they've conducted similar research that was ultimately adopted initially by the city of Seattle in some of their mandates. It's important to point out that these effects are primarily significant for taller buildings. They're less of an issue in short to mid-rise construction. So what they did is enacted some edits to their code so that taller buildings in Seattle would account for these effects. And eventually in 2018, the National Seismic Hazard Model in the US picked up these effects explicitly in their standards. Our hope is that we will follow suit and eventually account for these effects within our National Seismic Hazard Model and the Building Code of Canada.
From some of the experts we've been speaking to, they've identified what seems to be a sort of gap between policy and science here. The current models we're working off of seem to not indicate an accuracy, the severity of the big one.
The science is evolving all the time, and it does take time to incorporate that into our understanding and our plans. So we have two areas that we look at that. One is in our modeling to understand the impacts of an earthquake, and the other is more detailed in terms of how buildings will react to that the shaking that the science identifies.
I know that these building codes, they tend to be updated regularly, but is there anything missing, any gaps in terms of considerations for the most recent building codes?
Yeah, one problem is that the building code only requires buildings to be designed for life safety, so that people can escape from the building when the earthquake happens. There's nothing in the building code that requires the building to be habitable after even a small earthquake. So a real concern is that we're building all these beautiful buildings. They'll be relatively safe in an earthquake. People can escape, but then the building will not be habitable, and we'll have a city full of empty buildings.
So is it beauty over safety here?
In some ways that is the case, because one issue is that our buildings, our modern buildings, are becoming more irregular, okay? And irregular buildings are more prone to damage and are more likely to be uninhabitable after an earthquake.
The city of Vancouver has sent its emergency teams abroad to assist in rescue efforts in earthquakes like Christchurch. And the teams say that they're applying their learnings to ensure that Vancouver is as well prepared as it can be. And how does the city prepare for an earthquake it's never seen?
We have specialized drills for our teams that our urban search and rescue team, for example, that they drill monthly so that they can rescue people from collapsed buildings. We also look at earthquakes that have happened elsewhere and look at research that comes out of places like UBC. So we sent 4 staff down to New Zealand. We learned a lot from that deployment after the Christchurch earthquake, where we supported them and also went down to learn.
So Daniel, how prepared is the city of Vancouver for a megathrust earthquake just like the big one?
I think we've got many plans in place. We have specialized teams. We've put a lot of effort into upgrading our infrastructure, so seismic upgrades to bridges, for example. So we have a lot of response plans in place, but there's more that we can do. And some of our plans and our mitigation measures, such as upgrading water systems, sewer systems, and upgrading existing buildings, that's something that's going to take decades.
Things have improved a lot over the past 30 years. So the building codes have been improving every 5 years. They're updated. They incorporate the subduction earthquake. We have things like the shakeout drill every year in October. So schools have earthquake drills.
Right now, drop, cover, and hold on.
Everyone has an opportunity to practice what to do when shaking begins. None of that was around 30 or 40 years ago. When I was in school in British Columbia, there were no earthquake drills. So the awareness is really important. There's still more to do. We're still learning about earthquakes. We're still learning about tsunamis. So the awareness, the information is so important for all of us. And the simple things that we can do to prepare for an earthquake, having a kit and having a plan. And then all the scientific work and the engineering work that's underway that will make a huge difference.
So it's not all doom and gloom. Experts say advances in science and technology have come a long way, and industry leaders have been working around the clock to further develop an emergency alert system to ensure British Columbians have as much time as possible to get to safety. And with each and every passing day, science gives us more insight into what exactly the big one might look like, giving us a head start to prepare for what is to come. Should it be tomorrow, in a week's time, or in the next 50 years, British Columbia has the resources and expert knowledge to ensure that its citizens and visitors have the best chance possible of surviving the big one.
For something like an earthquake, there is always more that we can do, both as a city, as government, both as government partners at other levels, and the general public. We really encourage public, business community, and our response partners and community organizations to take a shared approach at this. We all need to take a part. We all need to prepare as best we can, and that looks different for different people.
We are consistently assessing and trying to address that vulnerability as our community grows. As climate change evolves, we're always exploring new options. There's still unknowns to the big one. Time will be of the essence, and I've said this a couple of times now, but it really is about getting to safety quickly and calmly.
The big one is a real risk that we have in Vancouver, and I'd say take some steps to prepare. The more agency you feel, the more prepared you are, the better you're going to feel about your ability to respond.
Today, the sooner you prepare, the better off you're going to be. And I know for some people that can be a challenge. The worst thing would be, facing an earthquake and you didn't bother to prepare, knowing that you should. You'll never forgive yourself, and your quality of life will be significantly better when prepared.
So 324 years ago, a tsunami did hit, and our nation was able to pull through and survive. And we're still here today. There's about, I believe, like 2,600 of us in the communities around Tofino right now. There was only a few hundred left back then, though, and then we've just grown since.